Interesting. They told you they loved you. They told you that you were their future. They told you they wanted a life with you. At the time, those words sounded certain. And for a while, things seemed to match them. Then small things started changing. Not the kind of changes they explain or talk about. The quiet kind you notice without knowing what to call it yet. They started hiding their phone when messages came in. Conversations that used to feel open suddenly felt guarded. Questions that once had simple answers started getting strange reactions. Plans that once sounded clear slowly turned into vague promises. Messages took longer to answer. Sometimes the warmth that used to be there simply wasn't. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious enough to confront directly. Just enough to make something feel wrong. So, you did what most people do in that moment. You turned the question toward yourself. Maybe you misunderstood something. Maybe you expected too much. Maybe you were reading into things that weren't really there. So, you replayed conversations in your head. You looked at small details and tried to find the moment where you might have caused the shift. And the more you searched for that moment, the more complicated everything started to feel. So eventually the situation gets a name. Confusion. You tell yourself you just need more time to understand what's happening. More time to see the whole picture. But sometimes the situation isn't confusing at all. Sometimes the truth is already there. And seeing it clearly would mean deciding what to do next. Well, at first you try to explain those changes in ways that make the situation easier to live with. You tell yourself they're just stressed, busy, distracted. Life gets complicated sometimes, so you give it time. But the pattern doesn't stop. It slowly becomes clearer. I see. They still say the right things when the conversation turns serious. They still repeat the promises that once made you feel certain. But the way they behave in everyday moments starts telling a different story. You begin noticing how often your questions are redirected instead of answered. A simple conversation turns into a vague explanation. Something that should take 10 seconds suddenly becomes complicated. You also start noticing what happens when you try to address the change directly. Instead of clarity, you get irritation. Instead of openness, you get distance. Sometimes they say you're overthinking things. Sometimes they tell you nothing has changed at all. And sometimes they simply avoid the conversation completely. So, that's when the situation starts to feel unstable. Because now you're dealing with two different realities at the same time. One reality lives in their words. They still say they care about you. They still say the future is there. They still say everything is fine. The other reality appears in their behavior. The distance. The hesitation. The way certain questions suddenly feel uncomfortable. And those two realities don't sit well together. So you start doing something very human, you try to make them fit. You take their words and use them to explain their behavior. If they say they love you, there must be a reason for the distance. If they say the future is still there, maybe the tension is temporary. You keep adjusting the story so it continues to make sense. But the pattern keeps showing up. They become harder to reach emotionally. Conversations that once felt natural begin to feel careful. You notice yourself thinking more about how to say things than about what you actually want to say. And slowly, without really planning it, your focus shifts. Instead of asking whether their behavior makes sense, you start asking whether your reaction makes sense. Maybe you're reading too much into things. Maybe you're creating problems that aren't really there. That's where the situation becomes exhausting. Because now the problem is no longer just the change you noticed. The problem is that you no longer trust your own perception of it. And when that happens, confusion becomes a very convenient explanation. It allows the situation to stay exactly where it is. It postpones the moment when you might have to admit that the pattern you're seeing is real. Well, at some point, you start realizing that this isn't just a series of random moments. The same situation keeps appearing again and again, only in slightly different forms. You begin to notice that the pattern doesn't really disappear, it only pauses for a while. They say something reassuring, and for a moment things feel stable again. Then the distance returns, the hesitation, the guarded reactions. The shift is subtle, but it repeats often enough that you start recognizing it. It creates a strange kind of loop. Every time something feels wrong, their words pull you back into the story you want to believe. And every time their behavior quietly pulls you out of it again. So you begin doing something very exhausting. You keep negotiating with what you already see. And then, part of you recognizes what they've been doing clearly. You notice the changes, the contradictions, the small moments that don't quite add up. But another part of you keeps searching for a version of the story where those things don't mean what they seem to mean. That inner negotiation can go on for a long time, because accepting the pattern means accepting something else as well. It means admitting that the situation you hoped for may not be the situation you are actually in. And that realization carries a consequence. Once you see the pattern clearly, you cannot pretend you haven't seen it. From that moment on, the question slowly shifts. It stops being about understanding them, and it starts becoming about what you are going to do with what you already know. You're saying that after a while, the situation becomes harder to ignore. Not because something dramatic suddenly happens, but because the same thing keeps repeating. The same promises appear, the same explanations, the same reassurances. And each time, their behavior quietly moves in another direction. You begin noticing that the gap between those two things is not getting smaller. It is slowly getting bigger. They still say the right things when the conversation becomes serious, and they still reassure you when you begin asking questions. For a moment, you may even believe things are finally settling down. But the feeling never really goes away. Each time you start trusting the words again, something small pulls you back into doubt. A reaction that doesn't match what they just told you, or a moment of distance that doesn't match the promise. The pattern quietly repeats itself. You start noticing how careful your conversations have become. You think about how to ask questions without starting an argument. You measure your words, hoping the discussion will stay calm. That effort slowly becomes exhausting. At the same time, their reactions begin changing. Some questions suddenly make them uncomfortable. Some topics are quickly redirected to something else. And some conversations simply end before anything is actually explained. Sometimes they tell you that you are overthinking things. Sometimes they say you are creating problems that are not really there. Sometimes they remind you of the promises again, as if repeating the words should settle the situation. For a while, those explanations still work. You want to believe them, because believing them keeps everything in place. It allows the relationship to stay where it is without forcing any difficult decisions. But the small moments keep returning. Another strange reaction. Another delayed message. Another plan that quietly disappears. None of those moments are dramatic on their own, but together they start forming a clear picture. Eventually something begins to shift inside you. You stop focusing only on what they say, and you begin paying closer attention to what they do. That change is quiet, but it changes everything. When you start watching behavior instead of promises, the situation often becomes much easier to understand. You notice how much effort you are putting into keeping the connection stable. You notice how often you are the one trying to fix the distance. And once you see that clearly, another thought slowly appears. The situation is no longer just about understanding them. It becomes about how much longer you are willing to stay in something that keeps repeating the same pattern. So, by now the situation probably feels very different from how it felt at the beginning. At first you were trying to understand what was happening. You were looking for explanations that would make everything fit again. You kept hoping there was something you had missed. Now things look simpler. Not easier, but clearer. You remember the words they told you, and you remember how certain those words sounded at the time. But you also remember what followed. You remember the distance that slowly appeared, the guarded conversations, and the moments when simple questions suddenly became a problem. You remember how often you walked away from those conversations feeling unsure of yourself. For a long time you tried to make those two things match. You tried to believe the words and explain the behavior. You told yourself there must be a reason, something you hadn't understood yet. That effort probably lasted longer than you expected. But now the situation is sitting in front of you exactly as it is. You can see what they say, and you can see what they do. And you can see how often those two things move in different directions. That is usually the moment when confusion starts disappearing. Not because the answer feels good, and not because the situation suddenly becomes easy. It simply becomes harder to pretend you don't see it. And once you see it clearly, the question changes. It stops being about what they mean, and it stops being about what they might say next. The question becomes what you are going to do with what you already see. You can keep explaining it, or you can accept the situation as it is. The next step is entirely yours. If you decide to